Hello there, everyone. So I'm not able to be on campus this week, so I'm doing today's lecture as a recording or two, and so here we go. So we started on topic 12 last week. We just got into the beginning of it with some definitions. And before I get in there, just a reminder that assignments are due November 7th. So if you are watching this video on November 7th, here is your reminder to hand your assignment in by the end of the day. So I already went over this slide here last day, just some definitions: microbiome, microflora, microbiota. They generally mean the same thing. They're referring to all the microorganisms that live in and on your body. And this is a big part of what we want to talk about today. And this includes bacteria, viruses, protists, fungi, many things. And although we'll be focusing a lot on the bacteria, this is the part that we often talk about. And when we're referring to our microflora, there's a huge focus on the bacteria, maybe because more is known about how they interact with us in terms of our human health. And they have both positive and negative effects on human health. And these are some of the things I want to talk about today. So what are some of the benefits? We've talked about these things a little bit already, kind of at the beginning of the course. Some of the benefits you can see are, for example, we talked about E. coli. E. coli makes vitamin K in your digestive system. It also can help us digest food. In fact, there's a lot of microorganisms that help us digest our food. And another thing they do is they make habitats unsuitable for other pathogens that may try to grow in the body. Something else that we're really starting to understand a lot about in the last 10 or 20 years is how these microorganisms are essential for the proper development of our immune system, especially when you're an infant, but also really important for proper immunity as an adult and preventing autoimmune diseases and things like that. Really, really interesting field has opened up looking at the microbiome and the immune system. Of course, many of these microorganisms can also be pathogens, particularly if they get into the wrong part of your anatomy, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And when they're pathogenic, they can cause disease or symptoms and those kind of things. And so, that's, of course, a big part of this course and something we want to cover a little bit today in terms of how they might be causing diseases. I think I mentioned this last day, the whole microbiome, microflora is just a massive area of research right now. And here's a bunch of headlines of things that I've been looking at the last little while, and you can see really just covering a huge number of areas of human health. So, for example, your microbiome may affect how you metabolize drugs, such as cancer treatments or other kind of drugs. They may affect how you absorb vitamins. They may affect how you absorb nutrients. You can see there the microbiome has been linked to chronic fatigue syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, huge number of things. So some definitions. Often when we talk about our microbiome, sometimes we talk about resident flora versus transient flora. So resident flora means things that are with us at all times. So for most of us, for example, Staphylococcus epidermidis is on our skin always. Once we're born, it gets on our skin. It always lives on our skin. We always have it on our skin. Other microbiome, other flora are called transient. So Staphylococcus aureus is an example of a transient flora in that it kind of comes and goes. So at any given moment, about a third to a quarter of us have it on our skin right now, and it can last there for days, months, weeks, years, and then it goes away. And then it comes back, and then it goes away and comes back. And it's just kind of comes and goes. How do we get these things? Well, I mean, it depends on who we're exposed to, what we're touching, what our hygiene habits are, gender, sometimes genomics, diet, all those kind of things can affect your microbiome. If you're an infant, if you're breastfeeding or taking formula, those kind of things can also affect what microorganisms are on your skin. And this is something that, again, there's a lot of researchers trying to understand this quite a bit. Just 1 second here. So So how do we get our microbiome? We call this acquisition, and this has been studied a lot in these germ-free animals that they can produce. So you can see there's some mice there. They're called gnotobiotic mice. So they've been born to a mother mouse, and the mother mouse was treated with a bunch of antibiotics, and then they do a C-section on the mouse to get these fetuses, these infants out sterilely, and they grow them and feed them in these germ-free cages or compartments, whatever you want to call them. And then they study them. So you can expose them to microorganisms one at a time, or try to understand, what the effects are. And these animals, it turns out, are not very healthy at all. Their gut microvilli are underdeveloped. Their immune systems are completely underdeveloped. And so we've learned a lot from them in terms of understanding how important these microorganisms are to our development. Both of our digestive system and our immune system in particular are very, very well understood. So generally, the womb before you're born is considered sterile. I think there's some evidence now to suggest there might be some microorganisms in there, even though very low numbers. I think there's a little bit of debate on the area. But generally, once the water breaks, when the baby is getting ready to be born, that's when it's going to start to get exposed to microorganisms. So once the water breaks, microorganisms that are found in that area of the mother are going to be getting in and into the child's skin, mouth, nasal area, those kind of things. When an infant's being born, it's going to be exposed to, assuming it's born vaginally, it's going to be exposed to the vaginal microflora. Again, face, mouth, eyes, skin, all those kind of things. It's going to get colonized as it's being born through the birth canal. If it's a C-section, it's going to get exposed to different microorganisms. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but there's some differences there. As soon as it gets out, humans are touching it. Parents, medical personnel, many babies breastfeed. There's going to be microorganisms on the breasts, and so it's a process. It takes time. A lot of bacteria are exposed to the infant, and colonization takes 6 months to a year before they really get colonized of what looks like a normal human. E. coli, for example, depending on exposure to fecal matter, for example, can take up to 6 months to get a proper E. coli colony in the large intestine. And many other organisms can take up to a year before a baby has a normal looking flora. Like I said, the food and the environment can have a massive impact on the acquisition in infants. So just going back to vaginal birth versus C-section, there's actually quite a few studies on this, and it's actually kind of interesting. And they see actually quite a big difference in the bacterial flora between C-section births and vaginal births. And this actually seems to have some health effects, right? So children born with C-section, as you can see there, are more likely to have type 1 diabetes, allergies, and asthma. And maybe suggestions of a few other things. It's not huge. I think it's maybe 10% more chance of asthma and things like that, but a statistically significant higher risk for these babies. And so there's some people that thinking that maybe we can change this. So maybe if you've had a C-section, there's been some people thinking that maybe they can take a swab from the woman's vagina and spread it onto the baby's skin and facial area. And so this is called vaginal seeding. And I see this practice is being promoted a little bit on the internet. And at the moment, the science is not there. There's been, as far as I can tell, there's been a couple of small studies done on this, and they didn't really see any health benefits. In fact, there's some suggestions that there might actually be some health detriments in that these children are getting more prone to infections. So maybe someday we'll know the science a little bit better. We'll know maybe which precise organisms to, there'll be a spray or who knows. But an area of intense research. So kind of interesting again. There might be other things going on with a vaginal versus C-section delivery as well, or in terms of how children are getting exposed and gaining a normal flora. Okay. Yeah, just I found this study here just kind of interesting, showing the diversity of the flora as a child is born and gets older. And like I said, about 6 months to a year before it's starting to look like most other humans. Of course, there's so many changes during a lifetime. If you look at the diet of your average 6-year-old versus your diet of your average teenager, you're getting all sorts of other things going on, right? Teenagers tend to eat a little bit more junk food and pop, and maybe they're not eating their vegetables as well. You can usually control the diet of a 6-year-old a little bit better than maybe a 16-year-old. But many things going on: exposure to antibiotics, other diseases, uh, all those things can affect our microbial flora. Although we do see a little bit of aging going on as the human body gets older, we start to see the diversity can change a little bit. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the flora or microbiomes of certain anatomical sites. These microorganisms are found all over the body. And people have done all sorts of studies looking at the skin, but even just talking about the skin, there's so many different sites on the body that are skin, and some of them are warmer, some of them are cooler, some of them are moist. So if you look at your armpit versus, let's say the outside of your arm, you're going to see a little bit of a difference. If you're looking at, other crevices, so, sometimes people have, innies for their belly buttons, and you have a different microflora there. And all those kind of things. Never mind, some people have habits that may, some of us shower daily, some of us never shower at all. All those kind of things are going to affect our microflora. Most of the microorganisms, if we were to do an actual count, huge numbers are found in the digestive system, particularly the large intestine. But also, like I said, found all over the body. And I want to talk a little bit about some of these body parts for this lecture. So first, let's talk about the skin. Sometimes the conjunctiva is grouped in there. The conjunctiva is, of course, the surface of the eye, which is relatively sterile. Not completely sterile, but your eyes are constantly, there's liquid called tears kind of washing over them all the time. And so there's a really small number of microorganisms found in the eyes. The skin, you can see I've got a list there on the right. And, if you take a look here, let me just circle a couple with my pen, right? So these are organisms we've talked about already. All the ones that I have in bold are things that are important for this course, right? And so we talked about the Staphylococcus. There's a few different Staphylococcus. The main two we talked about in this course are Staph epidermidis and Staph aureus. Normally found in the skin, can be pathogenic. They can survive on the skin because they don't seem to mind dry environments and salty environments. Most other microorganisms don't live that long on the skin. It's usually relatively dry there and kind of salty from our sweat, and so that actually kills a lot of microorganisms, whereas these two naturally live on the skin. Just a reminder about these. So Staphylococcus epidermidis is a normal resident flora, lives there all the time. Staphylococcus aureus is more transient, kind of comes and goes, can cause more serious infections. And actually, one more Staphylococcus for you, just for interest, Staphylococcus hominis. I think this one actually was discovered relatively recently. Like, I feel like in the past 10 years, I'd have to double check that. So you're probably wondering what this one is all about. Well, I don't think it causes any infections, at least not any serious ones anyway. But this one is well known for making body odor. That's right. So if you have lots of this one, it makes these, I think they're called thiol esters, these little compounds that kind of stink. And some of us have more of this Staphylococcus than others, and we don't need to mention any names. But, it does happen. So, say no to BO. Have your showers if you have that one there, and maybe you can change the profile of the microbiota on your skin. So here's another one. I mentioned this last day, that not all the microflora are actually bacteria in nature. Here is actually an animal that lives on us. Yeah, this is kind of gross. These are eyelash mites. They live in your eyelash follicles, believe it or not. Maybe not everybody. Most of us get colonized eventually. And as you get older, you're more likely to be colonized by these things. I guess it's just a matter of time. And these are spread by just direct contact. So, touching people, which we do, we touch other humans and eventually we just get colonized. So my understanding is they rarely really make anybody sick or anything. Sometimes people get infections from them, bacterial infections in the follicles, which might be caused by these eyelash mites. But I don't really know a lot about them. There are other human mites, by the way, that live on our bodies. You can look them up. But just thought I'd throw in something interesting in there. Okay, so moving along. By the way, the list I'm giving you are not the only list. If you look in the skin, for example, there's probably hundreds of microorganisms that can live on the skin, but the Staphylococcus are important in this class. Upper respiratory tract. So now we're talking about the mouth, the nose, the throat, those kind of areas, and you see different differences in the nose and the mouth. The nose tends to be cooler than the mouth. Back of the throat, the tonsils tends to have a little bit of a different profile than the tongue. These things change all the time with the food we eat and with the weather. Our noses tend to be a little bit cooler in the winter, for example, a little drier, though, that can change things quite dramatically. When the last time you brushed your teeth can change your flora in your mouth dramatically, and so on and so on. Here's some of the organisms. So again, you can see Staphylococcus. You're going to see on these lists, it's the same organisms are on many of the lists. So Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, E. coli, Candida. You see these on many of the body parts. You can see I also threw in Neisseria here on this list. Neisseria meningitidis is commonly found in people's saliva, can cause meningitis, and so is considered part of the normal microflora, even though not everyone has it at all times. We can move a little bit deeper in the respiratory system, and I'm not really going to talk about it too much. So the bronchia, the lungs, those kind of places, we actually have very few microorganisms in there. Probably not zero. Older textbooks used to say they were completely sterile unless you had an infection. There's a lot of newer studies that seem to suggest that there are microorganisms in there, just in very small numbers. We have mechanisms for expelling the microorganisms. In particular, we have mucus. And so microorganisms that go down there when we're breathing get caught in the mucus, and then the mucus gets expelled. And so very few microorganisms in there naturally, unless you've got an infection, of course. If you've got pneumonia or tuberculosis or something like that, then there's going to be much higher numbers. So we won't say it's sterile, but we'll say it's near sterile normally for the lower respiratory system. Potential pathogens, so Streptococcus, pneumonia. We're going to talk about pneumonia in a couple of weeks, but many organisms can actually infect the lungs and cause pneumonia or pneumonia-like illnesses. Just the most common one is Streptococcus pneumonia, but Staphylococcus can do it. E. coli, in some rare cases, can cause pneumonias, and obviously lots of viruses and other organisms as well. So much more on pneumonia a little bit later. So let's not forget one of the common infections of the mouth is yeast infection. So this is usually called oral thrush or just thrush. So this is caused by the organism Candida albicans. So we've talked about this one a little bit already. And so if you have an infection with this, it's called candidiasis. Sometimes that term is also used to, of course, refer to vaginal yeast infections as well. And so the general people who are at risk for this are infants. They just don't have, they're just not colonized by enough bacteria yet. And so if the yeast gets a chance to kind of grow and overgrow, then there it is. This can affect other parts of the body. It can get in the blood. It can infect other parts of the body as well. I've heard of people getting candida infections in sort of sweaty areas. So armpits, bum cracks, those kind of places. I'm not sure how common that is, but it can happen. And so usually what you're looking at is kind of, an overgrowth of yeast. And so, there's some white pasty stuff, as you can see on this tongue here. Often some irritation, itchiness, things like that are pretty common in these kind of infections. I think I mentioned before at the earlier part of the semester, other people are at risk too for thrush. So sometimes people who have other weird things going on in their mouth. So smokers are another example where they're ingesting something into the mouth that can affect the bacterial flora, AIDS patients, sometimes other people with on weird drugs or immunocompromised individuals. Okay, so moving down into the digestive system. When we get down to the digestive system, mostly we're talking about the intestines, and particularly the large intestine is an area where we have huge numbers of microorganisms. The other parts are more or less just the way to get there. The stomach and the small intestine, much smaller numbers. Most organisms can't survive in the stomach that long, but they can sometimes survive long enough to get to the intestines. If you remember, the one example of the microorganism that lives in the stomach regularly is Helicobacter. Let's see here, Helicobacter pylori. And that one is the one that is associated with stomach ulcers. And that one will naturally live in the stomach and is very happy to do so. Most of the rest of the organisms we're talking about the intestines, of course, right? And so if you take a look at our list, it's the usual suspects again. We've got Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, no Staphylococcus, amazingly, although I believe it does get in there just in small numbers. We did mention Enterococcus before. E. coli, of course, is maybe the most famous one. Clostridium difficile, of course, and many of these are also potential pathogens for different types of infections as well. And so I've got a couple other things to say about the lower digestive system. Here's a graph I found, and you can see the breakdown of these things. A lot of them are these firmicutes, these are all gram-positives, as you can see on this list here. And the gram-negatives are these, how do we say that, bacteroidetes or something like that. And that includes E. coli. And then there's, or actually the proteobacteria include E. coli, sorry about that. A lot of these are benign. They don't cause illness and whatnot. And there's a huge list of these. I think there's been at least 1,000 organisms that have been, classified, being found in human fecal matter. Some debate on which one of these are normal flora and or should be normal flora, some people say, and all that. E. coli is actually a really small amount of the organisms found in your intestines. Why is it so famous? Because it's just really easy to culture, grows really well in a lab, and was discovered a long time ago. So that's why it's so famous. And but we do have many other microorganisms, of course. Found this study as well, and you can see they're showing these graphs here, so you can see the variations as people age and go along, and so you can see that it's the same colors as the previous chart, right? So the red is the firmicutes, and the Bacteroides is the blue. I think it's the same color. Let me just check. Red is, no, the color is swapped. Sorry about that. But anyway, the point is you can just see the diversity changes as people age. And that's just part of the human life cycle, is having your microflora age along with you. So here is an interesting study, and you can see the title of my slide: Can my microbes make me fat? Interestingly, this study was, oh boy, I think it was at least 15 years ago now, and it's amazing how we really don't have any answers on this. So in this particular study, what they did was they took some of those germ-free mice, and they took some microbiomes. So they took some fecal samples from some normal weighted people and some heavier obese people, and they fed them to the rats and or mice, and colonized the mice with the microbiomes of the donor humans. And it turns out that the mice who were given the microbiome from the obese people, they seemed to absorb nutrients better, and they had less control over how much they ate. So it seems that a microbiome can influence your eating habits and maybe your weight. There's still a lot that's really not understood about these studies. There's sort of a little bit of the kind of the chicken or the egg kind of scenario in this, in that the question is it the microbiome that can allow you to gain weight, or do you end up with that particular microbiome because you have some other propensity to gaining weight? And trying to do these studies in humans are not that easy to do. There's a few sort of case studies that suggest that your microbiome can heavily influence your weight gain. But that's not the only part of the formula. When you're looking at human BMIs and body masses and things like that, it's actually a really complex health issue, of which this may just be part of it. Of course, we don't know, is this 5%? Is this 50% of the whole formula? We don't really know. And I think I'm just amazed at how much we don't know, even after this study done. Like I said, I think it was about 15 years ago now. So anyway, some more interesting stuff about the microbiome. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the genital areas. And so, of course, there's differences going on with the sexes, male versus female. Maybe the first thing to mention is that we can talk about the urinary tract. So the urinary tract is generally considered sterile, at least most of it anyway, unless you have an infection, of course. The thing about the urinary tract is it's kind of a one-way passage. When we urinate, the urine pushes things out, and so most microorganisms have a hard time getting in there into the urethra or the bladder. It does happen, and that would be a urinary tract infection or a bladder infection. The exception is kind of near the entrance because, of course, it's the entrance, and there are bacteria and other organisms living around there. But for the most part, we're looking at a relatively sterile system up in the urinary tract. Now, men and women are different. Men, there's going to be basically skin flora on the penis and related areas in the genital tract. And men who are circumcised tend to have a little bit of a different flora under the foreskin than men who are not circumcised, and so on. But for the most part, we're looking at skin flora, and although some particulars, and also, of course, there may be some flora related to sexually transmitted infections as well. Women, on the other hand, much different system going on there. The vagina, for example, has quite a few different microorganisms living in there. The pH of the vagina does change with a woman's menstrual cycle, but for the most part, it's an acidic environment. And so this does inhibit the growth of a lot of microorganisms that can't handle the acidic environment. If you take a look at the list here on the right, lactobacillus, an organism we're not going to talk about too much, but there's actually a lactobacillus called Lactobacillus acidophilus, and it actually produces acid. And so this microorganism is actually an important part of a normal vaginal microflora to provide a healthy environment for the vagina. Like I said, it does change a little bit with a woman's menstrual cycle as the body temperature and the pH does change a little bit cyclically. And some people do. There are some procedures that are not recommended that some people may do to change what's going on in there. I can't think of the name at the moment, but these cleanses and things like that, and they're not usually recommended cleansing up there because it can change the microflora and can be unhealthy for you. Something else to think about for women is that the rectum and the vagina and the urethra anatomically are a lot closer than they are in men. And so there can be cross-infection between these areas. And so, if you have a child and your child is a daughter, that's one of the important things to teach them is, which direction to wipe. You wipe away from the urethra when you wipe your bum, right? And that's one way to, try to prevent bladder infections, for example. Another thing to consider, is the type of clothing you wear. If you wear cotton underwear, that's better than wearing synthetic underwear. Synthetic underwear can actually allow moisture to transverse between these different anatomical places. So just some life tips for you there. If you want to know more about it, you can find that information readily available in many places. We'll talk a little bit more about bladder infections and other things a little bit later on in the semester. So we'll kind of get there. Here's some potential pathogens. You can see we're looking at a lot of sexually transmitted infections that aren't necessarily part of the normal flora, but they can live there and thrive there. And a lot of these microorganisms, they like the genital area because it's a little cooler. It's not quite 37 degrees, maybe 34, 35 degrees in some areas. And these organisms like to live there and thrive there. And we'll talk more about some of these microorganisms later as well when we talk about sexually transmitted infections. Okay, so that's kind of our quick run through of the microflora or the microbiome of the human body. There are, of course, a lot more complexities and nuances to the whole thing. Like I said, you know, when you look at different parts of the body and how warm or moist they are, that can change the profile. But we do want to move on and talk a little bit about some other concepts. So here's another definition for you: microbial antagonism. So this is something good that our microbiome is doing for us. It's going to prevent the growth of many other microorganisms, and some of those are potential pathogens. So the question is, how do they do this? They can protect us a few different ways. One is just occupying space, right? So we call this a niche. You occupy that space, someone else can't get in there. So that's the whole idea. And this is why taking antibiotics can make that space available for opportunistic infections. So we talked about, for example, yeast infections or Clostridium difficile can thrive when the normal microbiota are killed off by antibiotics. Some of these microorganisms produce acids. So I mentioned the lactobacillus in the vagina is a good example. I'll just write that here. Produces acids and makes that environment a little acidic, and also so that other organisms can't live there. A lot of these microorganisms also produce specialized chemicals. So you can see this one here, bacteriocins. So bacteriocin, this is a protein, and I hesitate to use the word toxin, but they're sort of like toxins. Bacteriocins are proteins that basically inhibit other microorganisms. That's all you really need to know about them. And so they're planting ground and they're secreting these substances. It doesn't harm the organism that's secreting them, but can inhibit the growth of other microorganisms, many of them closely related. It will inhibit their growth. And so, these are just three ways that they can help our flora can protect us from pathogens. So I want to talk a little bit about probiotics now. So some of you may know a little bit about probiotics. Basically, a probiotic is some sort of live culture that you're applying to your body. In many cases, we're talking about eating them. The most famous type of probiotic are all these probiotic yogurts that you can find now. And there's a whole bunch of them out there. You can see I've got a couple examples here. We've got Activia, Danone. I wonder if they're the same company. I'm not entirely sure. I have to look that up. But there's so many out there now. And they'll usually have written on their label somewhere about, that they have live microorganisms. And sometimes the claims, you can see this Danone here, it's talking about supporting our immune system. And sometimes they have other claims on them. But there's a whole bunch of them out there. If you go to Activia, if you go to their website, they've got all sorts of studies cited, and they're really trying to sell their product. And of course, there are many of these products out there now. I saw this one here, these Attune probiotic chocolate bars. I don't know too much about them. I saw the product. I don't know what their claims are. I'll show you a few other products out there. I found this one here. I found this in the, I believe it was the Edmonton airport. I was flying through the airport. I went to the store to get a package of gum, and right in the gum section was these packages of probiotics, and I took a picture of it just for you guys. So you can see I went to their website, and this is their claim that this is going to help alleviate the symptoms of traveler's diarrhea. So all you have to do is eat these capsules, and the friendly bacteria are going to colonize your gut and do some good. So this is really the idea behind probiotics is giving people the good bacteria, which will hopefully take the place of the bad ones and hopefully convey some sort of health effect, right? So I've got some other slides here to show you. There's so many products out here. I got this Popeyes flyer. You can see they're trying to sell a whole bunch of probiotics, and I haven't looked at all the claims on these. There's just so many products now. Here's some others I saw in the grocery store. These baby puffies. These are actually really tasty. I tried these. They're the little puffy treats for babies. These ones are strawberry flavored. I really thought it was a very tasty product. Again, I don't really remember what the claim was. I didn't read the label. I just tried them and they were very tasty. Lots of these products out there. Saw this one in Save On, I believe. Here's some others. And you can see, I think this was Superstore, if I remember correctly. And some of them are really, really pricey. You know, one there for $52.99, and people are buying these things. This is a $1 billion industry now. They don't all have to be ingested. I found all sorts of probiotic skin lotions and facial creams and those kind of things. And like I said, the main thing is that they have some sort of microorganism, and usually they're making some sort of claim about some sort of health effect. Apparently, you can even get probiotic pet food now, which makes sense. If it's good for us, maybe it's good for them. So kind of interesting anyway. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the claims of probiotics. There's kind of a few different organisms out there. There's actually a few dozen, but really kind of grouped into these three categories. You can see lactobacillus. Yeah, that's related to the one. This is something that makes yogurt, and it is related to the one that's found in the human vagina. Bifidobacterium, Saccharomyces, and you can see some of the major claims, right? Supporting digestion. So this kind of makes sense, right? We're eating this, so maybe the effect should be in the digestive system. You know, again, helping digestion, metabolic processes, maybe regulating blood sugar, relieving diarrhea, digestive problems. All those kind of make sense. You can see some related things, reducing anxiety. There is a connection between the gut and the brain. There's something else about brain function. So some of these things are not fully really understood in terms of whether they're helping or not. I made this table for you, and you can see that you know, the big capital S's are where we've probably seen the best the best health effects from probiotics. The smaller S's and the maybes. The thing about probiotics is it's like any type of nutritional research in that everybody has a different body. So you can do these studies. I went to a conference, and they were talking about these women with reoccurring yeast infections, and they're put on these probiotics, and I can't remember what the percentage was, but a certain percentage of those women were finding absolutely they were finding health benefits from taking these probiotics. I think it was less than 30% of them. But that means the other 70% has zero effect whatsoever. And that's the same with all these probiotics, is that every study that's ever been done, you never see 100% it's helping everybody. It's only helping a certain percentage. And often it's not even half the people. So it's obviously helping some people, and there may be a lot of other variables involved. A lot of bacteria we're feeding people, we're feeding them because they're easy to grow, and then we can include them in yogurt. But there's probably a lot of other beneficial bacteria that we can't grow very well in a culture and we can't put into foods. And so maybe someday that will change. We'll get better at this. You can see there's all sorts of other health claims, you know, around the immune system, helping with colds. Like, I don't know how this is supposed to work. You're eating yogurt and it's going to help you with your allergies. I'm guessing probably not, but maybe. Again, there's a lot of connections between the gut and the immune system and the brain, things that we don't really fully understand at this point. So, you know, if you're going to eat probiotics, great. That's fine. And if you find a health effect, that's even better. But I would just suggest, if you like yogurt, go for the one that tastes the best, unless you find that it's actually giving you a health benefit. Although that may change. Maybe someday, you know, we'll be better at making probiotics. Okay. Kind of related to probiotics is this procedure out there. It's called a fecal transplant. So it's kind of related to probiotics, because here's where we're giving somebody a microorganism and some good ones. And so fecal transplants are exactly how it sounds. What you have are people that have maybe an unhealthy gut microflora, and we need to establish a good one. And so you find a donor, a human donor. Usually it's somebody they're living with or a relative, and they get a stool sample, and I think they sanitize it somehow. I don't know what that means. I believe they rinse it with a saline buffer or something like that, and then they give to the person. It can go through either end. There are methods to give people enema through the rear end, or take it orally and replace their flora. And you can see I have this note here about 95% success rate. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about for treating C. diff. So C. diff, Clostridium difficile infections are notoriously hard to treat. They're quite naturally resistant to a lot of drugs. And many people who have C. diff infections, we're talking about getting drugs 2 or 3 times to try to clear the infection. And it doesn't necessarily always go away for a long time because you're taking drugs. So what are you doing? You're killing your normal flora and having a hard time reestablishing a good flora. And so in recent years, there's been a number of clinical studies looking at doing these fecal transplants and finding that who needs drugs when we have poo, basically? I know it sounds really gross, but 95% success rate. How often does anything have a 95% success rate of clearing the C. diff infection and giving someone a healthy microbiome in their gut? It's really remarkable. It's taken a little while before these studies were done because it's not really interesting pharmaceutically. The pharmaceutical companies can't really patent your poo. And so it's something that had to be done by basically doctors who are interested in looking for better patient outcomes and that want to do this research. And there's clinics now that do this full time, and huge success rate. So something very interesting. I think I've got a little slide here I found that's showing how this is done. Here's the processing. And you can see they're put into these pills or enema form and they're being delivered. You can watch this video if you want to check it out. I believe this is from a clinic in Calgary that does all these fecal transplants. The interesting thing about fecal transplants is they're starting to see benefits for other things. You can see here's some articles you can check out. For example, for autism symptoms, a lot of autistic children have these digestive disorders. And so what do you do about them? Give them a healthy microbiome. Cancer therapy treatments, maybe there's a healthy microbiome can help you with your mental health. There's some promising science here. Again, we're really at the very beginning, and who knows, in 10, 20 years, maybe we'll know a lot more about these things. So here's a little graphic I found that's talking about the C. diff infections. I thought it was kind of cute. I thought I'd share it with you. So there's C. diff there. Remember, it's a Clostridium, and it makes endospores, and it can cause diarrhea. So how does this work, right? So you can see here's somebody here, and they've got the normal gut flora, and the endospores are there. Maybe not too many of them, or maybe the person's in a hospital and has ingested some by a nosocomial infection. And you can see this person here is having some broad spectrum antibiotics, and it's going to kill the normal flora, and that's not good. And so now the C. diff gets a chance to grow and flourish, and you can see it's looking like it's having a lot of fun there, and it's becoming a big part of the gut flora. The microorganism has some toxins, and those toxins, what do? They affect the intestinal cells, and that leads to diarrhea. And so you end up with mucus and diarrhea and bad smell and a lot of discomfort, and in the end, it's hard to get rid of. And how are you going to do that? So now you know the answer: fecal transplant. Okay, so I wanted to just talk a little bit about opportunistic pathogens, and this is kind of a good segue into the second part of this lecture, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So what is an opportunistic pathogen? This is where a pathogen gets an opportunity, and I'll talk about those opportunities in a minute, but a situation changes so that you have some microorganism that is normally commensal or mutualistic, and now it has become pathogenic for certain reasons. And so the textbook has a little table, and it's I've kind of taken those situations and I've grouped them in 4 categories. So often you'll see the definition of opportunistic pathogens talking about immune suppression, but that's really only one circumstance where a pathogen can become opportunistic. There's many reasons why someone may have a suppressed immune system. They could be very young or very old. They could have AIDS or measles. They could be under immune suppressing drugs due to organ transplants. And so, lots of opportunities, right? Another is a change in normal flora. So we mentioned this when people get antibiotic treatments, and this can lead to yeast infections or Clostridium difficile infections, and that's opportunistic, and there's no immune suppression there. Sometimes we're talking about introducing your normal flora to a different anatomical site. So a classic example is going back to our normal flora is talking about intestinal bacteria getting to your urethra. And this is why, we're telling our children to wipe away from the urethra because we don't want to be introducing things like E. coli to the urethra and getting urinary tract infections. But lots of examples of the Staphylococcus, if it gets off your skin and gets into your lungs, can cause pneumonia, get into your brain, can cause meningitis, and so on. And then I have kind of category 4 is other complications, things that do weird things to your body. Cystic fibrosis is a good example of that. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder, and people have sort of a thicker mucus in their lungs, which can be a habitat for some microorganisms. And so that's kind of a other complication category. Here's a list of other opportunities. You can see most of them kind of fit into one of those 4 categories. So burns patients, I would consider that kind of immune suppression. Very young, very old. Surgical patients, we're looking at introduction of normal flora into other body parts just due to invasive procedures and things like that. But anyway, lots of examples. So make sure you know what a definition of an opportunistic pathogen is, because it's definitely going to be on the final exam somewhere. So you want to know a definition, and maybe even a couple of examples would be good for you to know. Okay, so what I'm going to do is break this lecture into 2 parts. I'm just going to take a little breather and I'll record part 2. And so this is the end of part 1.